Hello, I'm Matthew, and what better way to answer the question before us than to speak to my colleague Stephen, Dr. Stephen Lloyd, who is not only a lecturer and researcher with Biblical Creation Trust, but also the pastor of a Grace Baptist church in the southeast of England. So thank you, Stephen, for joining us today from, I have to say, what is one of the most orderly offices in the country. And first of all, can I ask you, do you think, some of the encouragements or strengths of the evangelical church in the UK today? I mean, we've inherited a great legacy of Reformation and revival, mission and evangelism. Is that still evident today?
Well, I think it is still evident in the sense that we are still here. We are very much built on what the Christians of the past have done and have taught us, and how they've got us to this point. So we can be very thankful for how the church is persevering. And I think as well, it's very easy to look back on the past and see it as some sort of golden age. But actually, when you read what church life was like in the past, pretty much the same sort of struggles as we have today. So overall, I think there's a lot we should be thankful for.
And on the other side, then, what are some of the challenges, leaving aside the obvious current restrictions due to the pandemic, but some of the theological or practical weaknesses generally in the evangelical church today here?
Well, I think one of the challenges has actually come from a success of the church. The church has been very successful in university evangelism in the last few decades, and it's led to a church that I think is the evangelical church is very sort of middle class. There is a lot of work going on to try and reach more underprivileged communities, but still culturally that's the case. I think on a slightly different sort of level, as a whole, the church is better at exegesis than theology. You see it at an academic level. Someone like Jim Packer, who died recently, was actually very unusual in being a sort of such a prominent theologian. Our strengths have been more in sort of understanding the details of the text, and that has, I think, been fed into preaching. A lot of preaching could be sort of very exegetically accurate, but maybe lacking some theological depth and breadth. So the preaching can sometimes be a bit formulaic. And I think maybe in apologetics as well, we're not as strong as we think we are. We think we're giving good answers, but I sometimes think there are answers that don't always connect very well with where people are actually at today in all the cultural changes there have been.
Yeah, somebody said to me recently that church is better at doing than at being, sometimes lacking the practical application of the preaching, for example. And then coming on then to creationism in particular, I mean, we're also the homeland of Darwin himself, and there's been in recent years a huge promotion of, or there's a continual promotion of evolutionary thinking, of course, in the secular realm, but also within the church, with organisations like the Faraday Institute, which is our equivalent of Biologos, pushing a theistic evolutionary approach. So to what extent has that affected the church?
Well, I think it's created a lot of cultural pressure on the church, where there's this sort of narrative that to question evolution, or certainly to believe in creation, makes you an idiot, basically. So in particular, to believe in a young earth puts you on a different intellectual planet. So when that comes to the church, that's just a total apologetic liability, is how this is portrayed by groups like Faraday. And I think they are increasingly trying to be very strategic, not simply in reaching current leaders, but actually influencing the next generation. They're increasingly producing materials for actually quite young children sometimes, to introduce this way of thinking of trying to sort of reconcile the Bible with evolution. But there is a sort of a problem, though, I think, with their strategy, in that in the end, it's an approach that it's about stirring up apathy. It's really saying, look, there's nothing to see here. This is not an issue to worry about. Don't get uptight about it. So it's actually quite hard to sort of generate further interest and work when you're basically saying this is not an issue to worry about.
Yeah. And so why do you think it is that theistic evolution is increasingly popular among evangelicals and leaders and so on?
Yeah, I think we have to look at this almost sociologically, as well as just thinking about sort of the arguments that have been used. Sometimes we think, oh, it must be they just came up with the best arguments. I don't think that's always the case. It's very much about personal influence. And I think there were some key leaders in the student movement in the 1950s, 1960s, people like Oliver Barclay, people like Donald Mackay, who was a neuroscientist, who were very godly Christians, who were a great influence, but they promoted the sort of way of thinking that encourages theistic evolution. And that has shaped people that are in leadership today, and indeed people that have then been trained by them. You've had a whole generation of very eminent scientists who are Christians who have been shaped by this thinking. So that has then played into the church. You know, the church is going to listen to, you know, to people that are eminent scientists in their congregation who are, you know, sincere Christians. They're going to listen to their views. And I think as well, the attraction is it's a lot easier to be a theistic evolutionist. There's no extra work required. You know, you can accept the standard findings of science. You don't have to start doing some new work to try and answer these questions. So it just feels like a sort of safer, easier bet apologetically.
Mm-hmm. And we often say, don't we, in BCT, that we're trying to change the nature of the origins debate. So are there ways, do you think, in which that debate is different in the UK compared to, say, the US or elsewhere?
Yeah, I think it's really important to appreciate the big cultural differences between Britain and America. Even though in America you have this church-state separation, the reality is the church actually has far more influence on public life than in Britain, where you have a sort of nominal state church. You know, for example, you would never elect a president that isn't portrayed as some sort of churchgoer, whereas in the UK, to be a sort of seen as quite religious would harm your electoral prospects. There's no Christian universities in this country. There's far less homeschooling, and that all changes the nature of this debate. And I think it means that in this country, the creation debate is less polarized, or maybe less aggressively polarized, both between Christians and non-Christians, but also you know, within the church. But it is still polarized, and it's polarized enough to terrify a lot of pastors. You know, pastors will have people with different views in their congregation, and they are terrified of addressing this issue or being too sort of one way or the other on what they're saying, because they're desperate to keep understandably, to keep the congregation together and to, as they would see it, focus on what matters, the gospel.
Yeah, there are huge differences in state education, aren't there, as you say, and in primary or elementary and high school settings. I mean, it may not be so easy now to promote creationism, but there is that nominal Christian foundation that makes it quite easy for Christian teachers, for example, to speak about Christianity in school as well. So when it comes to young people and students, how well are we doing in as the church, as church leaders, in not just encouraging young believers to hold on to a creationist position, but in encouraging them to pursue origins-related fields of science when appropriate?
Yeah, I mean, I think you do it a lot better in the United States. There is quite a culture of fear, I think, amongst churches that are perhaps more sympathetic to creationism. There's a fear that young people will lose their faith if they study the wrong subjects. And maybe even a bit of a sort of spirit of not really seeing the value of study almost for its own sake, to glorify God, not even for its apologetic purposes, but simply because we are understanding God's world better. So, you know, the focus can simply be on, you know, reading the Bible, evangelism. Those are sort of spiritual things, but to worry too much about these other academic issues, well, that's not really something we should be doing. And I think that's a wrong way to think, and it's not actually historically where Christianity has been. When you look at the past, I mean, universities, academia has actually come out of Christian thinking, and I think we need to recapture some of that and have some of the courage to study the difficult subjects, to study the subjects where we are going to be challenged, where it is going to be difficult to be a Christian. But that is perhaps what our calling is in this day and age.
Yeah. So finally then, in relation to creationism in the UK in general, are there any other encouragements or signs of hope for a reversal of the current decline?
I think leaders are key in this, and I think we are seeing a new generation of leaders who do understand, who do get it on creation. And how much they're going to be ready to make an issue of that or speak out on that, I'm not so sure. But I think there are some changes in amongst the leadership. And there's also changes in our wider culture that we would tend to see as sort of negative, but they actually give us, I think, more of an opportunity for creation thinking and to show how relevant and important this is. You know, all the different issues over transgenderism, human identity, all of that. You cannot address those as Christians without dealing with creation. And I think that gives us an opportunity to show why this really does matter. But I think our biggest challenge is in many ways to get creationism not seen as this sort of side issue for a few people that are just fanatical about it, but to see it as mainstream Christianity. That, you know, when we're talking about the incarnation or something, well, you cannot do that without integrating that with your understanding of creation. And it's where I think sometimes creationists have not actually been the most helpful. We've tended to focus a lot on a few sort of verses or proof texts and lacked a more theological approach that's needed. We often think, you know, science is the weakness in creationism, whereas in many ways I actually think it's more theological. I think there's a lot of theological work to do as creationists and to show, yes, why this is mainstream. But and just historic Christianity, we are not the oddballs. We are the, you know, we're just saying what the church has always said. And you know, just an encouragement on that. I was involved in a men's conference earlier this year where I was invited to be part of a panel answering questions. And what encouraged me about that was that they saw someone with some expertise in creation had something to say to these other issues. So creation, you don't just get a creationist when you want to talk about creationism, but actually this is helpful for other issues too. And I think we need to see a lot more of that this is just part of course, what we are as Christians.
I remember you doing that, and of course you get other opportunities too to speak on Origins issues to trainee pastors, the ministers of the next generation. Yeah. Well, thank you, Stephen, for joining me today, and we do trust that this has been helpful to you all listening in to the creation celebration, and to know how to pray for us really here in the UK as we remember you too, wherever you are, in our stand together for God's truth of creation and the gospel of Christ. So thank you, and bye for now.